Over the last year, I've talked about The Forest by Thomas Ott on a couple of occasions. First, I reviewed it as a new read alongside the Incal Black and White Deluxe Edition and Life of Che by Osterheld and Breccia. And then in my most recent videos, a look back at the year, I revisited this book as one of my most memorable reads of 2022. And in both those videos, I got comments from people professing their love for Thomas Ott, the admiration for his work, as well as an equal number of people saying they'd never heard of him before or were unfamiliar but intrigued by what I had shown. Now, one could say this is true for almost all artists. There will be some people who know them and some people who don't. But with Thomas Ott, it seems a little different. He seems extremely popular in Europe, both for his comics as well as his illustration and fine artwork, but lesser known, relatively speaking, in the United States and Asia. In this episode of For the Love of Comics, I'd like to talk about a handful of comics by him, some of the influences and comparisons that he draws, but also what makes his work so unique and special, as well as a couple of thoughts on what to seek out by him and my hopes for the future of his work. So here's a quick look into the unique and spellbinding works of Thomas Ott. The most immediately striking thing about the works of Thomas Ott is definitely his art style. Using a mind-boggling scratchboard technique, Thomas Ott's black and white illustrations have often been compared to or said to be reminiscent of Passionate Journey by Franz Masriel and God's Man by Lind Ward, two earlier 20th century woodcut novels, textless, one image per page woodcut pictures that make a narrative, both of which are considered sort of proto-comics and extremely influential in sequential graphical storytelling. And looking at Thomas Ott's work, which are often single or few images per page, no text, all in this high contrast black and white style, one can definitely see the similarities. But instead of wood blocks in which carved pieces of wood are covered in ink and then stamped onto paper, Thomas Ott works in a scratchboard style. So a white surface is covered in black paint and then he chips away or scratches away the black paint to reveal the white underneath to create these images. This style is something I've encountered before, but I think with extremely thin lines, which always gave the art, to my eyes, a sketchy and almost photo-negative look, where the lines were white on a black surface. Thomas Ott's technique, to me, for lack of a better phrase, seems thicker and more oppressive. He's scratching away a lot more of the black, and yet the white seems to be struggling to be seen. Its luminescence always seems to be fighting against the black, which gives all of his stories this wonderfully eerie and oppressive feel. This laborious technique imbues every image with an incredible level of detail. It isn't so much that you're seeing a lot of items, it's just that the textures and the splay of light and shadow seems to be woven or knitted together. So rather than being photo-negative, which would give it a slightly abstract feeling, these images are very much about being illuminated in the way that we would see them, and yet having this otherworldly cast to its presentation. But what makes Thomas Ott so special, what makes him Thomas Ott, is not just how much of a virtuoso he is at this incredible technique. It's also the stories that he chooses to tell. As you can imagine, this is a laborious and time-consuming technique, which is probably why most of Thomas Ott's work, at least what I've encountered, tends to be short stories, even short shorts. There are some that are just a couple of pages. Many of his stories end with a sort of twist ending, some more elaborate than others. And they remind me in structure of childhood favorites like the short stories of Saki or O. Henry. Also of Roald Dahl's adult short stories, the ones that are nasty and macabre, and it's not always about justice. You can have a bad guy get his comeuppance, but you can equally have an innocent person suffer. But more than even those stories, Thomas Ott really reminds me of Tales from the Crypt and shock suspense stories and weird tales, the stuff that EC Comics used to publish. Just like these stories, Thomas Ott's stories twist characters' lives and situations in ways that are increasingly complex and terrifying until we get to some sort of a denouement, which feels simultaneously pulpy and predictable and extremely satisfying. I don't think most of these twists are supposed to be mind-blowing, as in a plot revelation that you just just couldn't imagine, especially for people who are familiar with pulp and genre fiction. I think it's gotten to the point where we can imagine almost everything. We have seen it all. It really comes down to how well has it been executed. And that's where my core love of Thomas Ott really lies. His embrace of the creepy, the pulpy, and the ironic. I'm celebrating Thomas Ott as a comics artist, but he is an illustrator and a fine artist who's extremely celebrated. This mastery of the art form is being applied to give a more modern and contemporary twist to this pulp that we know. When I read Thomas Ott's stories, the characters all feel desperate and ugly. Everything that they're involved in, their pettiness, their greed, their avarice, is represented through this art style and through the careful selection of what is in close-up, what is being focused on, and how much time you're being invited to give to every single image to allow it to soak into you before you move on to the next image. This is a slowed down comics reading to create psychological tension in a way that I have rarely seen anywhere. Getting to read Thomas Ott, though, is not as easy as it should be, with particular caveats. The first book I ever read of Thomas Ott's was The Number, and this is perhaps the longest work of his that I've read. It tells a story of this strange number that makes its way from one person to another and the consequences that it carries with it. A story that evokes both Darren Aronofsky's Pi as well as Japanese horror movies, but of course with a completely unique presentation. But I found this book because I was looking for another book that was out of print. That was Cinema Panopticon, probably his most famous comics work. Cinema Panopticon is a collection of 5 stories. Actually, one of the stories is a frame story of a girl visiting a carnival and looking through 4 different machines, each of which shows her one of the stories in this book. Both of these books are published by Fantagraphics in these nice hardcovers with cloth spines, but unfortunately, both of them seem to be out of print. From what I understand, Fantagraphics started publishing comics by Thomas Ott in the early 2000s in these large, slim hardcovers, often collecting 2 to 4 stories in each one. This one, for example, is Dead End and contains 2 stories. There are at least 2 others, but once again, each of these is out of print and hard to find. All of the books I've shown so far, with the exception of The Forest right at the beginning, I've bought secondhand. And in my secondhand hunting, I was also able to find R.I.P., the best of Thomas Ott, 1985 to 2004. This contains 19 short pieces from the mid-80s to the early 2000s. From what I've been able to glean online, Dead End, Tales of Error, and Welcome to Hellville, the 3 slim large books Fantagraphics had put out, all of the stories in those 3 are contained in R.I.P. with one exception. The story The Honeymoon is not part of this collection, but there are many more that aren't in any other collection that I can find that are included in this book. I'll put the table of contents up on the screen and you can pause if you want to check against any edition you might find, because this too seems to be out of print, although still available secondhand if you're lucky enough to live in a place that has that available. Of course, a large format always seems preferable to something this size, but I feel that Thomas Ott's work draws you in so much physically as well, where you pull the book closer to peer closer to admire the details, that I really don't think that not having it in the album size format is such a big loss. And these 3 books, Cinema Panopticon, The Number, and R.I.P., do make a very handsome cloth-bound set on the shelves. Having said that, it's really a pity that these books are out of print and hard to get. But here's the wonderful thing about Thomas Ott. All his stories that I can think of, all of them are textless. They have no language other than the visual, other than his art style. And understanding the context and piecing things together is so much a part of the activity of reading these stories that it really doesn't matter which language edition of his works you get. So there are Swiss, French, German editions, there are Italian editions, Spanish editions, any edition will do. Of course, here in India, all of those editions are even more expensive than Fantagraphics. I don't know whether it's because of shipping or whether they're out of print as well. And that does say something for a publisher publisher like Fantagraphics, in spite in some terms being a small publisher, they still seem to have more of a print run and more of a presence that I'm at least able to get my hands on some books. And I think with the publication of The Forest, the time is ripe for Fantagraphics to get into reprinting the Thomas Ott work that they obviously have the copyright to. Fantagraphics has been on a bit of a reprint roll lately, reprinting not just the Eternaut, but also Chuckling What's It by Richard Sala, and of course the Tardi Manchette stories. These new Tardi volumes are the same size as the old Ott volumes, so maybe there's even a chance of getting the stories in RIP at this size, and maybe a slipcase box set like the Manchette box set for the Number and Cinema Panopticon. Let's see what the future holds, but in the meantime, I encourage you to seek out any Thomas Ott that you can find, any edition, any language, a singular and unique artist with a surprisingly accessible oeuvre. Thomas Ott is someone everyone owes themselves at least one attempt at checking out. That's it. Thank you for watching. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next video.